I'm 3 months into owning the X100V, and in the last 3 weeks, finally got the chance to take it out for some solid real-world use. So I feel like it's finally time to make a first impressions video. Now before we start, I want to give you guys a quick background check. I consider myself an amateur enthusiast photographer. Prior to owning the X100V, I was using the Fujifilm X-T2, and this is the only X100 camera I have ever used. I see a lot of reviews on YouTube done by professionals who use this as a secondary camera, or people who have owned previous X100 models. As someone who now uses this camera exclusively and has never owned an older generation X100, I hope I can offer some genuine new user experience for the X100V. Let's first talk about the user friendliness. I think one of the most important aspects for a beginner photographer or a new user to a different system is how easy it is to pick up straight out of the box and use. For a niche camera like the X100V, I will be honest and say it isn't very user friendly. Once the excitement of acquiring a new camera has subsided and you switch the camera on for the first time, it just feels like any other mirrorless point and shoot camera. It doesn't feel like that special niche camera you were expecting it to be. That sounds obvious, but for how uniquely positioned the X100V is in Fujifilm's camera lineup and in the camera ecosystem in general, you would expect some level of pre-customized settings that reflects and optimizes what this camera is touted to be. Now, I'm not one to assume, but I do believe a lot of people who buy this camera want to use it for documentary and street photography. And for me especially, in that regard, I would have preferred the camera to have operation sounds preset to off, at the very least. What would be nice of Fujifilm to do is implement a first-time startup configuration mode, where it will guide you through the most important or commonly adjusted settings with you, have an explanation of what each setting does, and give you the option of turning off or on the settings. That would at least save new users from having to dig around in the menu settings later on and figure out what each setting does. From a beginner's perspective, that is what I would like in a camera. So yeah, unless you know what you are doing, the user friendliness of setting up the camera out of the box is not great, and no doubt you will be referring to the user manual for directions. Until Fujifilm comes up with something like that, if you want a quick rundown and setup guide of my settings I use for the X100V, click the card to check it out. Otherwise, all links are in the description box below. Next up on user friendliness, I want to talk dials. I love the dials on the X100V, and I like the concept of implementing the ISO into the shutter speed dial to save space. I like the fact the dial ring for the ISO stays up when you pull it up and snaps back into place when you push it down. I love the aperture dial and the shutter speed dial and even the exposure compensation dial and how it has just the right amount of resistance and click response. They all feel very solid, tactile and premium. However, real-world usage has me second-guessing the actual convenience of it all, especially the ISO and shutter speed dial. On my X-T2 there was a dedicated dial for ISO and shutter speed, and I did use that extensively. However, on the X100V, when you have the camera to your face, it is very difficult to pull up the ISO ring and change the ISO on the fly. Again, from a street photographer standpoint, real-world operation of these dials in fast-paced environments is just too clunky and outright annoying. I have two solutions for this problem. One is to map the ISO to the front command dial and the shutter speed to the rear command dial, and the other is to just use the auto ISO feature and not worry about it at all. Both these optimized solutions require you to adjust settings in the menu. Case in point for user friendliness, if you are absolutely new to photography and buy the X100V, you will be slightly frustrated with the usability of the camera out of the box, and probably get more frustrated once you use it a while in the real world. Next up, let's talk performance. I was very pleased with the performance of the X100V. The 23mm f2 lens is amazing and produces lovely, sharp images even at f2, which, from what I have researched, is a step up from the previous lens on the older X100 models. Focusing speed is fantastic, and for most people, the perceivable speed of focus is very good. For people like myself who have come from the XT interchangeable lens bodies and have used lenses such as the 23mm f2 or the 35mm f2, you may find the X100V's lens to be less quick at acquiring focus in certain lighting situations, especially in single point focus mode. Definitely not a deal breaker, but if you are new to the X100V, there will be a noise upon startup and shutdown of the camera, where you will hear an electronic humming noise from the lens. This is normal, so don't freak out. Focusing with this lens, especially when close focusing, you will hear the electronic sound of the motor moving the lens barrel while it is trying to acquire focus. It isn't loud, but you can definitely hear it when you have your eyes to the viewfinder. When the camera is at chest or waist level, you will still be able to hear it in a quiet room, but outside with moderate ambient noise, it isn't audible at all. One thing I do wish the lens would have is a focusing scale. Shooting with manual focus is still something I do from time to time, and knowing the focus distance at any aperture would make things a lot faster. This would change the size of the lens, I guess, but just something to think about if Fujifilm wants the X100V to be taken more seriously as a niche documentary/journalism camera. The startup time and shutdown time isn't super quick, and because of the lens extending in and out of the barrel, I'd say it takes a second or so. I have found myself missing a few photo opportunities simply because I had it off and needed to switch it on again. So now I just keep my camera on most of the time, unless I know for sure I'm not going to be taking photos for a while. The viewfinder on the X100V is fantastic. Brightness and refresh rate are both really good. So good in fact, I found myself not really ever switching to the optical viewfinder at all. I know the hybrid viewfinder is a unique trait of the X100 camera, and there are certain advantages to using the optical viewfinder, but I'm just so used to seeing through the digital viewfinder, seeing the film simulation in real time, the what you see is what you get aspect is something I don't see myself switching out of. Another thing I like about the X100V is the flip screen. I understand this is the first X100 camera to have an articulating screen, and while it is really convenient for a camera of this size, it feels like a slight downgrade coming from an X-T2. The three-way articulating screen on the X-T2 was incredible for street photography, especially for low-angle vertical shots. While the X100V screen is faster to deploy in horizontal mode, shooting vertical still means you are dealing with a fixed screen. There have been few instances where I was shooting vertical low-angle shots in bright sun and had to guess and pray that my image was relatively in focus, leveled, and composed properly. The focusing modes on the X100V are snappy and intuitive thanks to the X-Trans4 processor, and with the right settings, you can really nail focus and achieve sharp images, provided your shutter speed can keep up. Face detection works as it should, and I found it to be very accurate 90% of the time. On the rare occasion, it will miss a face or an eye, but for most users, there really isn't much to complain about here. When it comes to battery performance, I would say the X100V is just so-so. I found by having the camera on for the duration of a session, which usually lasts about 2 or 3 hours, turning on boost mode with continuous zone focusing, I can pull off around 300 to 400 shots before the batteries go flat. That isn't too bad, but it means I always have to change batteries at least once on a solid day of shooting. And finally, I want to touch upon a hotly discussed topic, pun intended. I have not yet experienced an overheating issue with my copy of the X100V. Granted, I don't use the video features this camera has to offer. I have said it in a previous video, but for how compact this camera is, and inclusive of the fact that it is weather sealed, the generated heat will be more obvious. The only reason I feel people would be concerned about overheating would be whether or not over time, constant exposure to high thermals will potentially damage any internal hardware inside the camera. All I can say is, If you stick to photography and only take reasonable minute or so long videos with this camera, it will not be a problem. And now for some general observations and personal thoughts. First off, the viewfinder modes. By default, I usually have it to switch between viewfinder and LCD via the sensor. However, sometimes I want to have just the viewfinder on and not the LCD, and sometimes the opposite. On the X100V, there is no dedicated viewfinder mode button, so the only way to cycle through the modes is to assign the viewfinder mode to a function button. But even then, it is still tedious having to press it multiple times to get to the mode you want, because it has to cycle through the different modes in order. It would be cool if Fujifilm gave us the option to assign each individual view mode setting to a function button, so we could toggle back and forth from our default view mode to the assigned one. Next is about the touchscreen. While I'm not bothered by the fact that a physical D-pad doesn't exist on the X100V, I am bothered by the fact that Fujifilm requires you to have the touchscreen function on to use both the function swipe actions and the touchscreen shooting modes. There is a tab to the top right side of the LCD screen that allows you to toggle the touchscreen shooting modes on or off, so you can just use the function swipe actions. But what I found was sometimes I would accidentally touch that tab and activate touch to shoot, and what ends up happening is I would be taking random shots simply from the touch screen brushing against my leg as I walk. I wish Fujifilm could have a separate menu setting to switch touchscreen shooting off only, so I can use the touchscreen exclusively for the swipe functions and vice versa. Another issue with the touchscreen is to do with responsiveness. I'm sure most owners have purchased a screen protector for their camera. I have the Expert Shield glass screen protector attached, and my experience with this is not entirely positive. The hit rate of the touchscreen actually registering my finger tapping on the screen is highly variable. Sometimes it is overly sensitive, but sometimes I need to hold my finger down a good second before the camera registers at all. This, coupled with the fact that touch to shoot works in conjunction with the swipe functions as I have mentioned earlier, can sometimes cause the swipe functions to activate instead of taking a shot, or the other way around. Depending on the situation, this could be either mildly or extremely infuriating. This video may have come across as me talking negatively about this camera, but I am simply trying to inform anyone who is keen to buy this camera that unless you know what you are doing, these will be the issues you will potentially run into. The X100V costs the amount it does because it is an incredibly feature-rich camera that, when correctly configured, makes it the perfect camera system for street, documentary, and simply everyday shooting experience. No camera is perfect, and all cameras require a degree of customization to optimize performance out of the box. However, for the X100V, a niche camera that isn't really intended to satisfy a generic crowd, I simply feel like it could perform better out of the box for a better first user experience. So this was an impressions video 3 weeks into using the X100V. I myself am still very new to the system, and I am constantly learning new things about this camera through trial and error. I hope to do another video talking about how I feel about this camera later down the line after I have more time using it. Hopefully this video has been helpful. If you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe, and please do share this video with anyone you know who is looking to start their photography journey with this camera. Thanks, and until next time.